Counsel in CDRH, and then I've been working at some large international law firms in DC for the last 10 years, and then recently just moved here to Salt Lake City to start up a FDA regulatory practice here in Salt Lake to service the bio and life sciences industry here in Utah. But it's also a pleasure to be here and excited to talk about one of my favorite topics, the FDA. My wife, I think, gets sick of me talking about the FDA, but we still do it. And as I'm thrilled and honored to be able to moderate this panel with very distinguished speakers today, I'm going to let them introduce themselves because I think they'll definitely do a better job than I would. So go ahead.
Hi, I'm Dana Andersen. I'm the Chief Technical Manufacturing Officer at Denali Therapeutics. We have a variety of products and clinical trials and recently opened a manufacturing plant here in Salt Lake City, so it's really great to be here today to talk about these issues.
And I'm Peter Marks, formerly with FDA until about April of this past year, and since then, more recently with Eli Lilly in infectious disease and molecule discovery.
Hello, I'm Chris Rogers. I'm the VP of Regulatory Affairs for BD. Been in Utah about 4 years, so still getting used to this wonderful environment here. And I've told several people today who are looking at different areas, I came from the Cambridge area, I came from Massachusetts, and when I came here, I thought, what's in there in Utah? It's a fantastic life sciences organization around here. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, thank you guys. So I assume since you're at this conference, you know who the FDA is, but I wanted to just provide a little bit of background. And I think it's good to remember a little bit sometimes what the mission and the goal of the FDA is. And I'd also like to just start out with a plug or just share my generosity, or not just my appreciation for those that work at the staff that work at the FDA, because it's a job that they do because they're passionate about public health, and many of them are very qualified. They could come to industry at any point, but choose to be there because of this drive that they have to, contribute to public health. And so I just pulled this from the FDA website. So the Food and Drug Administration is responsible for protecting the public health by ensuring safety, efficacy, and security of human and veterinary drugs, biologics products, and medical devices, and by ensuring the safety of our nation's food supply, cosmetics, and products that emit radiation. FDA is responsible for advancing the public health by helping to speed innovations that make medical products more effective, safer, and more affordable, and by helping the public get the accurate science-based information they need to use medical products and foods to maintain and improve their health. So from this mission, there is this balance between protecting public health, but also supporting innovation. And so as we think about the questions and what we're going to talk about, how that kind of like overlay plays into our panel. Some other just quick baseline dates, or just dates that I just wanted to plug from this last administration. Trump was inaugurated 11 months ago. Senator Kennedy was sworn in as Secretary of HHS 10 months ago. Dr. Martin Makary was sworn in as FDA Commissioner 9 months ago. Since April, there have been a number of reduction in force, layoffs. It's been a number of people have left the FDA through retirement incentives, and a number of have been let go. We're also experiencing, since October 1st, a government shutdown. And so, needless to say, the last several months have been a turbulent time to be working at the FDA, but also to be working with the FDA. And so, wanted to just highlight those things as we move forward. What I want to do real quick is we'll just start with this first question and then give each one of you an opportunity to respond. What do you see as the most promising regulatory initiative on the horizon with regard to interacting with FDA or HHS?
I'm happy to start on
Yeah,
this
go
one,
ahead,
which
Peter.
is, I think actually you should be able to read about it later today in New England Journal. I think there's been, over the past years, there's been a fair amount of work trying to figure out a pathway that will be more conducive to developing products for rare diseases, particularly ones where there is a strong genetic basis or a strong understanding of mechanism. This is kind of this idea that if you have a mechanism that you understand, you can develop a product where the function of the product is well understood, such as a gene therapy, ASO, others, that then you might not have to go through quite the same process to get an approval. And so they are trying to set up this structure here. There are some things that will have to be worked out here, because reimbursement is not a small piece of this. But I think seeing this move forward is a really positive step. It's something that's being pulled forward from work done during the previous administration, and actually, to be honest, dating back to the first Trump administration, before we got kind of distracted with this thing called the pandemic. And so it's nice to see it kind of coming into fruition.
That's great.
If I can add to that, the congressional reauthorization of the priority review vouchers for these rare pediatric diseases is really important to help provide the incentives companies need to develop these. For those of you who aren't familiar, if you develop a disease in this space, the FDA can offer these vouchers that you can use or sell to get accelerated approval for a product. And often these sell for in the range of $100 to $150 million, which provides enough incentive that when you're working in disease areas where there are very few patients, that's enough incentive often to make these financially viable. So we're waiting for Congress to reauthorize it, and that's really critical. But maybe to answer your question about the new things coming that we're really excited about, one is the pre-check program, which was recently announced, and in the process of formulating it. So we just built a manufacturing plant, as I mentioned, and one of the challenges in doing that, in this context where we're a lot talking how do we rebuild our domestic manufacturing capability in the U.S., is often the first, or typically the first inspection you give a facility by the FDA is in the context of a product review just a few months before the approval. And so if any issues are seen with your plant, any concerns, that can lead to delays, even rejections, which creates a lot of risk and uncertainty for companies to do this. So within the pre-check, there's been a public forum, and we're hoping to get that crafted in a way that the FDA can come earlier, give you essentially a GMP certificate, and bless your plant that this is okay to make GMP material, and then the product reviews can just focus on the product rather than have this risk hanging over your head that they might see something with the GMP they didn't like. So we're really hopeful that will be created in a way that will be really helpful both actually for every company that's trying to bring manufacturing, build new manufacturing here in the U.S.
So what I would talk about, I think, is ELSA. AI is here. Everybody's using it in different ways. I do not think it replaces reviewers. I do not think it replaces the experts. But if well developed and properly used, I think it's a great tool to help speed up the review, to find key points in the documentation, highlight them quickly, and help the reviewers get the job done quicker. So for me, I'm waiting to see how ELSA actually rolls out and how well it's used.
Yeah, and I think all of those are great, really important initiatives that they're bringing forward. One thing that I've noticed as well is just I do believe that there's been a big push in transparency in bringing more information that traditionally hasn't been published to providing it to the public. You can go to FDA's website, and I think you're able to find certain information that you used to not be able to find, but also I have had trouble finding some information that I used to be able to find. So I think there's a balance in making that work. One of the, as all companies, we have to work through the pre-market review process with the FDA. And so from development through clinical trials and then through the actual pre-market review. So what suggestions do you have for interacting with FDA around early stage product development?
Okay, so I think come early, come often, and don't be afraid of raising your hand. There are many companies that spend a lot of time thinking about the exact right time to go to FDA, and I think if the answer is if a question is making your development plan uncertain enough that it could have material outcome, it's time to go to and talk to FDA about it. And sometimes that's very early in development, even before you have a manufacturing plan, when you have a product, but you're not sure whether you should manufacture it one way or another way. Sometimes it's a little later after you have a product with a manufacturing plan, but you don't know what the best way to study it is. What you should do is become familiar with the different meeting types, because there's the interact meeting type, which is really a very early meeting that doesn't really count as a pre-IND meeting. It's something where you can get some advice. You don't have to submit a very formal regulatory package. It's almost like a grant proposal can get submitted, and you can have a conversation. On the other hand, if you're ready to submit an IND, you can have a pre-IND meeting, and that's another way of doing it. Generally, I will tell you, generally the agency likes to give one interact meeting and one pre-IND meeting. So you do want to keep things kind of, if you can, so that you use your meetings wisely. But there's also this new type of meeting, a type D meeting, which is a meeting around a very specific issue, like, oh, I have this problem with manufacturing. Here are some, like, 2 or 3 questions. So use your meetings wisely. But don't be afraid to interact. And the other thing is, the people that work at FDA are truly wonderful. They really do want to help. And I think particularly and you can't send them anything, that's illegal. But you can be nice. You can be Utah nice to them on the phone. Sometimes those informal interactions can make a huge difference. And it's something that at least when I was center director, we really tried to encourage, because the whole idea here is to try to help products get developed more rapidly. So that sometimes that congenial relationships can work well, because sometimes small questions don't actually require a meeting, and that saves you using up that meeting chit.
So I'm actually going to disagree with the you can't send them anything. And I'll get that there in a second. I think that we underuse meetings with 510Ks sometimes, because we think it's very straightforward. We know exactly what we're doing. And if you have a clear predicate, if you have standardized testing, you probably don't need a meeting. But when you've developed your own test, when the predicate is a little iffy, doing those meetings really help make sure that you don't get those AIs and those difficult questions later. And also, if you're doing something a little bit more novel, the STEP program, breakthrough designation, those are wonderful programs to get into. In regards to sending things, we have done that in the past, in that sometimes the reviewer just doesn't understand what you're doing. I know.
You can send them devices.
So,
be my guest, right?
Right. So, and I think that's underutilized too, right? So, we have sent devices to the reviewers where you include, a return slip and a clear, notice that says this is just for review. Please send it back. But sometimes letting them actually see and feel the device, I think, really helps the reviewer understand what it is, or videos also help.
No, that's really clear. I mean, that's sometimes made all the difference in the world, because on paper, you can spend a lot of time describing something, and when you have a device in their hand, it really makes a difference. Yeah.
Although I'm thinking sending a vial of something for dementia is probably not the right message, right? Is that? No, the only thing I would add is I found our most productive interactions have been when it can be as specific as possible. If you have like a challenge and a problem that's not going to fit in the normal track, you can spend months debating ways to do it, and often it's helpful just to reach out and have that conversation. My experience, when usually they do want to help, as Peter said, and it can often point you to the direction they've seen before, something that will work and be helpful.
What you just said is really true, though. The more specific the question you get, the better responses you'll get, and the less ambiguity in the responses that you get. The meetings that drive the FDA really crazy are sponsors who come and ask, they what happens in the back room afterwards is the FDA people go away and they say, wow, they should have hired a reg consultant to tell them how to do their development plan, not come to FDA and ask them to do that work. So you do need to come, the more specific you can come with questions. It also helps, the more specific your questions are, it actually enhances confidence of the FDA in your organization, because if you have very specific questions, it's clear that you're thinking about the regulatory process, you have a good grasp of your product, so it's just good all around.
Yeah, and in my experience, that is spot on. You know, I've had to represent companies that haven't done that on the back end, and it's hard. You only get one first impression, and once FDA has an impression, it's hard to correct that, and it takes a lot of education. And so definitely, I agree 100% that companies should take that extra effort up front and craft, you know, strategic interactions, not is my product a medical device or is my product a biologic. There's people in industry, consultants, FDA attorneys that can help you figure that out.
Right, and if you really need that, don't waste a meeting on it. Just submit either a request for designation or a pre-request for designation. They don't count against you, and you'll get, the difference there is a pre-RFD is not legally binding, and RFD is legally binding. So if you really want to know and you want to be legally bound, you send an RFD request. If you don't want to be legally bound, you send a pre-RFD request.
Yeah, but be careful.
Right. Be careful what you ask for.
Be careful what you ask for, because you might become a drug. So, so next question is kind of like in the same vein. Are there actions that companies can take if they're unsure or if they disagree with FDA's questioning or decision making, and then advice the advice provided by an FDA review team?
Yeah, I'm going to pick this one up because I think Michelle Tarver at the plenary session earlier really said this the right way, which is the first thing to do is very politely say, look, you're disagreeing with us, but something seems wrong here. Can I just repeat back what the question was and what I heard back from you, and just make sure that there isn't a simple communication mistake? By the way, that happens probably 10 or 20% of the time. Sometimes it's just because the communication's happening so quickly. Sometimes it's because someone heard something quickly. And remember that the average FDA reviewer who is handling INDs, at least in the Center for Biologics, they often have a load of like 50 to 100 INDs. So things can get a little jumbled. So first make sure that there really is a disagreement. Then if there is a disagreement, I think then you have to decide, is this worth escalating or not? Sometimes it's just not. If it's just a small issue, maybe you have to just decide, is it worth it? On the other hand, if it is a major issue, then there's no reason not to ask for supervisory review. In the FDA again, the way it's been run in the past, and I know now probably with Rick Pastor taking on CEDAR, which by the way is something, it was unintentional that happened yesterday, but I think what it will do is probably mean that this will apply there, which is that retaliation for escalation is not tolerated. Look, this is just the nature of the process, and sometimes, I had things escalated above my head when I was center director. It's just the nature of the process, so don't be bashful when you need to. But much like anyone who's served in the military will tell you, it's always best to go up chain of command. So don't go from asking, the sergeant to asking the general. Proceed through the lieutenant, the major, right up the captain, and so forth. It's a little more time consuming, but you'd be amazed. And I can't for confidential reasons, but the number of companies that decide, well, I don't like what this reviewer had said, so I'm going to go to the commissioner. That doesn't work so well. And oftentimes, you will find that if you just go one level up, the one level up, you might even hear things like, oh, I'm mortified. I'm so sorry that you heard that. Someone must have misunderstood something. So I would try to just, don't be bashful about escalating, but do it politely, again, as nicely as you can, but don't not escalate. It's just escalate in a manner that is respectful, which is next level. We'd like you to mind having your supervisor look at this, as opposed to, I'm going to the commissioner and I'm going to tell him you're a bad reviewer.
It's interesting. I've seen a couple cases too when even the way people interpreted the feedback wasn't what the FDA intended. And when they followed up and it says, this is what you really meant, to your point, it was exactly like, oh, actually, we read that differently and there was a lot closer. So it's a great point.
Another thing, one last thing on that, is very carefully read back your meeting minutes when you get them from FDA. And if something doesn't look like it's supposed to, get on the phone with the project manager right away, because that is a source, that is a lasting record. And down the line, when this guy goes to defend you, he's going to want those meeting minutes to reflect what you really think they did, not what was a mistake. So just make sure. Sometimes people think the meeting minutes are just like an afterthought. They're important. If it was important enough to have a meeting, it's important enough to make sure the minutes accurately reflect what was said and what you believe was agreed to.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I have had to escalate things many times at my prior firm, is known for doing that. So, and the one, some of the things that I just was thinking about is sometimes things can be avoided just by having a good, clear administrative record in clearly documenting all of your interactions with FDA. The challenge that an FDA reviewer has is they may not be the person that was on the IND meeting or the IDE, or that reviewed a prior part of your submission. And so it helps when you have a clear record of your communications and what advice or feedback FDA has given you. The other thing too is that I love that, and I know we have a new director at CDRH, but Dr. Shuren used to always go to conferences and say, hey, kind of throw the least burdensome flag. So if you feel like you're being asked for information that is really not necessary for demonstrating, a 510K clearance, substantial equivalence, or for demonstrating, the benefit risk of a device through a PMA or de novo, that is something that's in statute. And so you do have a right to throw that flag. But also totally agree, don't go to the commissioner or even to the director, because you need to have people that can review from an appeal standpoint. And so that's why you go one level up, is because when you go to appeal, you want the center director to be the person hearing that appeal, which is an administrative process, not just and then also, if you ever go to OCC, which is the Office of Chief Counsel, they're going to ask you if you've already gone through all of these processes. Chris, did you have anything?
So not a lot to add, but what I would say, in using Q-subs as an example, the record is the record. But sometimes, the company doesn't want to do another Q-sub. Take 70 days. Let's just convince FDA in the submission that what was agreed on in the Q-sub was incorrect. Much better to do the second Q-sub, because you have a record where, like you said, it might not be the same reviewer. You might get someone different. Do the second Q-sub and change that. Then you have a second record that changes it because you gave a more detailed description, or you gave them the images, or they held on to it. And so I would do the additional Q-sub. We talked earlier, Seth and I were talking, I have gone up through the ombudsman before to raise things. It's not something you want to do, but it is a path, and if there's a right reason for it, there is no repercussion. You get what you need out of it. I didn't have the agency mad at me afterwards, and we achieved our clearance because, again, with the ombudsman, we threw the least burdensome flag, and we won in that case. But there are times when you do need to escalate.
That's right. Okay. Next question is, have you seen changes in the pattern of how people are conducting clinical trials? So this is kind of a different question. And I guess we're probably going to see different things in device trials versus human clinical trials for drugs or in biologics. So Peter, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, so look, the issue right now, without getting into like messy details, what everyone in this room wants from FDA is predictability and professionalism, right? That's what you expect from your civil servants, whether they're your municipal civil servants or FDA. And unfortunately, right, you don't want the guy to give you a speeding ticket for like 5 miles over one day and 15 miles over the next. You want predictability and professionalism. You don't want any profanity from the police officer. All kidding aside, the issue here is some of the lack of predictability here and some of the challenges in knowing what's going to happen has led some to, at least I can speak now for big pharma and some of the big pharmas that I've dealt with, thinking about doing trials overseas because it's just easier. TGA is open for business. They're very predictable. You know what they want for first-in-human studies. It's a pretty low bar. China, another, it's pretty predictable what will fly there. Again, and whereas once you have the less predictability, it becomes an issue of time that people don't want to waste not knowing whether they'll get a given answer. So I think hopefully, again, I'm optimistic. I'm actually optimistic here that we'll start to see with kind of changes that are starting to hint themselves at FDA that this less predictable time is going to start to get more predictable, which will be good. And maybe that'll be helpful in onshoring a little bit more, but that's been one thing. And some of that's not just predictability. Some of it is people are ever more impatient and want speed. But I just, again, caution anyone who gets really excited about doing trials in China fast, but not accurate. You know, it's like, oh, I type 150 words a minute, but then you can't read what's written because it's not actually in English because there's so many typos. If you sometimes typing 50 words a minute and actually being able to have like 99.9% accuracy is much more preferable. And we see this sometimes with trials because we're just not as familiar with places, trial sites overseas. So I think that's the one thing I think has changed. I hope that more predictability brings things either back to the U.S. or at least back to a place where we're thinking about making sure that things are done with very high quality.
Right. Dana, Chris?
Device is a little bit different because you guys are happy in the U.S., right?
Device is a little different. Yeah, I guess what I would comment on is there is a place where you definitely need clinical trials, but I also think that companies need to look at real-world evidence sometimes. If for the initial clearance, you're probably not going to be able to pull that off. But if there's a predicate device that's clear and you're looking to make changes to your indications that you can support with real-world evidence, there's very clear guidance on how to assess it and determine whether or not it's going to be compelling. And you don't always have to do that, randomized clinical trial. You can collect evidence and use that. And we've been successful, and I think that you can be successful going that path.
Dana?
And yeah, just adding in the rare disease space, which I know Peter's very familiar with, some of those places too that randomized trials just aren't feasible to even get enough patients to do well. So being able to combine natural history data with biomarkers and other data can be a powerful way to get compelling evidence that your drug works.
Right. And I would like to just also pitch that, I think it's a good practice to, have FDA review your clinical trial plan before you start the clinical trial or your, your statistical plan. Because, I've represented companies where they've been able to do that, and FDA has provided that feedback on the clinical trial and the primary endpoints with the regulatory decision down the road in mind, and it's worked out for them. But then I've also seen companies that have gone through and done a full-blown clinical trial only to find out that, hey, this is a nice trial and you met your primary endpoints, but it actually doesn't have any bearing on the regulatory decision.
I want to just add something to this because I've witnessed this now several times, and it's actually come closer to home than I wanted to. Sometimes FDA will give advice, and they'll say, oh, we think you should power something X, and you'll hear from the statisticians about this is what they want. Then you'll come back to them with your protocol, which might be different than what FDA said, and FDA won't actually put it on clinical hold. Well, that's because they won't put things on clinical hold unless it rises to the level of a clinical hold. And then you finish your protocol and you bring it back to FDA, and FDA says, sorry guys, your endpoint didn't meet the regulatory bar. And then you say, well, but wait a second, we met with you and you told us, why didn't you tell us then when we sent the protocol in that it wasn't acceptable? The answer is, when you send a protocol in, things that rise to hold level are not necessarily things that, they're not responsible for making sure that their advice and your protocol align. So if you send in something that's different, don't be surprised if you don't get put on hold, but also don't be surprised if when you submit that and the FDA told you something different. In other words, if they said you need to have 90% power and you submit a trial with 70% power, they may not put you on hold. On the other hand, when you go to submit the actual application, they may say, sorry guys, you just didn't meet the criteria we told you about for this, and go back and add some more patients or do another trial. So just know that just because you're not put on clinical hold doesn't mean that FDA agrees with your trial. So if you do something different than you discussed with them, point out that you're doing this. It's not that you can't. Just let them know that, thanks very much. In our trial, we decided that we would power it differently. Is this acceptable? Even if you don't, call it out in the IND submission, you might want to call a project manager and document it. Document it with the name of who told you what.
Yeah, no, that's very good advice. Okay, we have a couple minutes left, but let's get to this last question real quick. What approaches have you found successful for introducing novel approaches in development, and what are the barriers to modernizing activities? I think, Dana, this was your question.
Yeah, we touched on one of the barriers already, but this risk factor, especially on the manufacturing side, and actually Peter talked about this morning in his talk, there is a need to modernize a lot of our approaches. Some of these things we've been doing for 30 or 40 years, yet if your risk of getting a product delayed or rejected altogether, it's very compelling just to default to the tried and true and remove that risk. So having early read and feedback from the FDAs would be really important for, really helpful for really test driving that. This is what we're doing. We think this is a better way of doing it and getting that approval. The other challenge up also is that, and also you touched on this in your talk this morning, that we live in a global regulatory environment, and very rarely do we have products we only commercialize here. These will be commercialized globally. And getting something that every health authority is going to agree to actually is really challenging. And the worst thing you want is to actually have both. Have two processes, one done the old way and one the new way. So solving those barriers are really important.
I would just say that this was something that I've had a real interest in for, again, this dates pre-pandemic. In fact, the last trip I made pre-pandemic was to WHO to talk about this. This issue of having to renegotiate requirements, manufacturing requirements, as you go to different regulatory authorities for a product that's meant to treat 100 patients globally, or even 1,000 patients globally, it's an innovation killer. And I think this is almost like one where we need to just bring all the different large regulators in a room and say, what are we doing here? Because what we're actually doing is hindering access for all of our patients in all of the countries. And I don't think we would be, it's not like we're adding, if I thought we were adding some real level of safety, it would be different. But I think what we're just doing is having barriers to entry that were each country developed for large volume products impair the ability for these rare disease products or small market products to get to patients. And so I think the sooner we can get to some type of global regulatory harmonization, the less expensive development will cost. And it'll be good for both. I mean, this is like one of these things that it's good for everyone. It's good for us in the United States. It's good for other countries as well, because there are plenty of products. This goes to the medical device industry, where things in Europe, which would have been nice to see here sooner. I think this is something that Jeff Shuren deserves a lot of credit for, because he helped modernize things so that people didn't just go to Europe, they're coming here more. But I think we need more harmonization in this area.
Yeah, agree. Well, I think our time's up. I could keep going for another couple hours. This is such an interesting topic for me. I'd like to thank our panel and BioUtah for having us. So thank you so much.